As the director of the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum, I have the privilege of working with local communities to amplify their collective power by collecting, preserving, and sharing their stories. Like the stories of this evening, many of them are not found in textbooks and are not known beyond the people that were involved. Because of books like Aran's, more people will not only know the stories, but the people that work tirelessly for positive change. I personally did not know the story of the 1979 massacre before reading this book. I learned about the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, of course, in college, but nothing about this event. I will admit I had to keep reminding myself that the book was recounting an event from 1979 and not 1959. The most striking thing about the book for me was the intimate details of Nelson Johnson's life as an activist that I never considered. I'm a sucker for a good love story, so I was rooting for him and Joyce right away. But aside from the brief moments of joy, there were low points that almost broke him. And Aran's writing brought that vulnerability to the surface. Now, instead of rooting for love, I was rooting for justice. Before I bring up the author of this wonderful book, let me say a few words about Aran Shetterly. Aran's first book was The Americano, Fighting for Castro for Cuba's Freedom. The story of William Morgan, an American who became a hero in Cuba for his fight for democracy. In the early 2000s, Aran founded, edited, and wrote for Inside Mexico, which became the most widely read English periodical in Mexico. I was lucky enough to attend the launch in Mexico City. Aran has also worked with his father for over 20 years on his educational project, Americans Who Tell the Truth. This project uses the power of art to illuminate the ongoing struggle to realize America's democratic ideas and model commitment to act for the common good. I am also proud to have the portrait of Frederick Douglass hanging in my entryway from this important project. Like the work at my museum, Aran's work is the result of hundreds of hours of tireless research. This research was supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Virginia Humanities. Just another example of why these organizations are vital to preserving and sharing the country's history. Aran and I are friends via marriage, meaning he married my best friend from college. We have spent time together over the past 20 years getting to know each other and forming a friendship. After reading this book, I believe I know so much more about Aran and his passion for history, community, and most importantly, encouraging people to tell their story. I can only imagine the work it took Aran to gain the trust of his subjects, and based on his writing, you can tell they were so much more than subjects to him. This was not an easy story to tell for many reasons, both historic and current, but Aran did an amazing job letting the voices of those who lived it shine through. And even though they didn't get justice in the traditional sense, I hope they are at peace knowing their story was told so eloquently. Please join me in welcoming Aran Shetterly to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Melanie. That was a beautiful introduction. I'm humbled and honored. And thank you, Rose, for having me here. And Nathan for putting it all together, and Linda for reaching out to me wherever she is. And to this amazing library. Man, I turned the corner over here and I said, wow, that's cool. And now that the windows don't leak, I hear, we're in good shape. Yeah. Melanie began with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who actually I'm going to come back to at the end of my talk, but I want to begin with some words from the brilliant and irascible W.E.B. Du Bois. This is the epigraph from my book, and I feel it sets the tone for what I'm trying to do, both in the book and in conversation. So, let me ask one quick question. Are there any people here who are connected to this history? I already know.
I'm from Greensboro.
You're from Greensboro? Okay. And there's a friend of a survivor back there of the shooting in '79. Anyone else? Okay. So, to begin with Du Bois, nations reel and struggle on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this, so far as the truth is ascertainable? If you haven't read his magisterial book, Black Reconstruction in America, I recommend it. It's a long read. It's like reading The Power Broker, Robert Caro's book, but it changes the way you think about power and about this country. I highly recommend it. I'm completely honored to be here in this context of the 1939 sit-in, and there's so many connections in a way between that courageous event and the one I'm writing about. I sit here and I'm so glad Rose mentioned it. I hear this story and I think about the courage of those 5 young men and what it took to go in and sit calmly in that library and know that it could change the whole course of their lives, or worse. And also, Samuel Tucker. Now that's a fascinating, interesting person who I'm actually going to connect to in a strange way or curious way in my talk a little bit. And then the idea, right, of how long it takes to reckon with our history. 2019, when these records got expunged, is that right, Rose?
That's right.
2019. 80 years. It takes a long time to change this place, or any place, I suppose. But one of the things that I really connected to was when you found out about this and your surprise, right? This happened here? Really? That's how I felt when I heard this story, and I'm going to tell about that. But you didn't stop there. You wanted to bring this history to light and not allow it to be erased. And that's so important because it seems to me that bringing history and telling history is always an act of resistance against the status quo. And it's especially so today. We're supposed to talk about the Underground Railroad without mentioning slavery right now. How do we do that? That's a pretzel. So I want to tell you how I got started on this story. So in 2015, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, with my father, who's a painter and has this project called Americans Who Tell the Truth, who paints people throughout our history who've confronted power, spoken truth to power. And there was a show at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. I think there were 42 portraits there. And the woman who organized that show said, there are 2 people you have to meet. And so we walked out of that museum, and you can imagine where it's in the Woolworths building, right? It's a great museum. It tells this history of the sit-in movement, which spread like wildfire through the South and ended up desegregating public spaces for the most part, those sit-ins over a number of years. And it tells that story of peaceful resistance, and it tells it well. And it's in a space that is significant because that's where it started. But she said, there are these 2 people you have to meet. And so we walked about 3/4 of a mile from the center of downtown Greensboro to the edge of downtown Greensboro to a little Salvadoran cafe and walked in and waited and waited and waited. And we're about to leave when all of a sudden the door opened, bright September light, and in walked Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife, Joyce Johnson. I didn't know who I was going to meet, really. I just knew their names. I didn't know much at all. And these 2 people sat down, and all of a sudden it was like this was the only place in the world they were meant to be, and they were telling us their stories. And so they told the story of how in the 70s they were organizing in the textile mills in Greensboro, which were still some of the largest textile mills in the world. Levi's dungaree material came from Greensboro for 100 years or so. And they were trying to bring workers together and across race. And they were having trouble doing it. And they believed that the Klan in 1977, 78, 79 was interfering with their efforts to do this. And so they decided, this multiracial group that had been the Workers' Viewpoint organization and had changed their name to the Communist Workers' Party, that they were going to have a march and conference to explain to people why it was important to work across race if you were going to organize, because if you stayed divided, you were just letting go of power and letting management do what it wanted to do. But if you could come together, you would have more power to advocate for better health care, better working hours, better conditions in the plant, et cetera. Pretty normal things for workers to want, right? And so they said, we're going to have this march that explains this, and we're going to call it the Anti-Klan March and Conference. And its nickname, which is big on the posters, is going to be Death to the Klan. So they're setting up on a Saturday morning, November 3rd, 1979, singing some folk songs and putting up a sound system. And all of a sudden, a caravan of 9 cars, and someone notices that there's a Confederate flag on one of the license plates. And a young boy yells, "Here comes the Klan." All of a sudden, a young man in the 3rd car shoots a powder pistol into the air. The activists start running away from that. The middle of the caravan, the Klansmen jump out and start a fight. And then all of a sudden, at the back of the caravan, some men are unloading guns from a car. And in 88 seconds, 5 people are dead and 11 people are injured. And they all drive away, not a policeman in sight, until the last second, a policeman who wasn't even supposed to be there drives up and stops the van in which most of the shooters were and arrests 12 people. So they tell this story. I'm sitting there in this cafe thinking, holy smokes. And then they tell a story that when they questioned why the police weren't there and suspected there might have been some complicity, they were fired from their jobs, ostracized in Greensboro, and blamed for the death of their comrades and friends. And then this goes to our justice system, right? So there's a state murder trial, all acquitted. A federal criminal civil rights trial, all acquitted. These trials happened in 1980 and 1984. In 1985, there's a federal civil rights trial. No judge from North Carolina would sit for that trial. So an amazing judge from Richmond, from the 4th District, named Robert Marriage, went down to Winston-Salem to preside over this trial. Now, Robert Marriage has a really interesting history. He made University of Virginia admit women. He desegregated the schools in Virginia and had marshals protecting him for 2 years and sent his kids abroad. His guest house was burned down and his dog was killed. So this is the kind of person he was who went down to preside over this trial. And at the end of that trial, the jury came up with a judgment that said the Klansmen, the neo-Nazis, the police informant, and 2 police were liable for death together, jointly. I don't know of another judgment like that quite in American history. And it speaks to the courage of that judge and the courage of the lawyers who were then representing those plaintiffs. So I'm listening, I'm in this cafe and I'm hearing this story. And I'm thinking, holy smokes. This is a big story and I've never heard anything about it. Now I'm drawn to stories of people who have the commitment and courage to try to change the world, And then what happens to those people when they go out into the world? What institutions how they respond to people like this. And I thought, this is a very interesting example of this. So I was feeling something, but what I really made the hair stand up on the back of my neck was the presence of Reverend Johnson and Joyce Johnson, is that they weren't cynical. They weren't bitter. They were still doing the work. They were still out. They had something, they have something. He just recently died in February. It's a true loss because Greensboro, I believe, is a better place because of the Johnsons. They have a center called the Beloved Community Center. And they continue working to make America, try to force America to be embrace democracy for all its people, right? And have everyone included in this project of ours. And so what really made the hair stand up on my neck was this spirit of theirs, this enthusiasm, this optimism that they could still make change after the trauma that they had lived through. And so a couple years later, when I had a chance to really think about a big project, I went back down and I sat with them and I asked their permission to sort of spend time with them and learn their stories. And they said yes, which in retrospect, I had no idea how much trust I was asking for them. They'd been burned so many times by people who, said they wanted to tell their story and then ended up kind of blaming them for what had happened. Death to the Klan. You baited them. It was a lot more complicated than that. And I also wanted to know why I hadn't heard this history, why I didn't know it, And there's some local and practical reasons. One is, immediately after the shooting, the mayor of Greensboro came out and said, nothing to see here. This has nothing to do with Greensboro. Just these two extremist groups got in a big fight. What can we do about that? Nothing. Now get this. The governor of North Carolina at the time, so these guys, the Communist Workers' Party, considered themselves Maoists, right? So they were following the sort of the Chinese communist philosophy, although they were not connected to any international group. This was a homegrown American group. And the governor of North Carolina was in China selling cigarettes to the Chinese, because that was a big market. And he's standing there pitching cigarettes under this huge poster of Chairman Mao. And he's in Peking at the time, right? It hasn't yet been changed the name. And he's in a hotel and he gets a call in the middle of the night. And his state security officer says, those communists from Duke, they just got shot. And the guy is saying this and realizing that he's calling China as he's just saying this. And that, who knows, everyone's listening. But the governor decides not to come back. Continues his Asian junket, doesn't make a statement, and pretends nothing happened. Now, when the mayor and the governor don't acknowledge that anything has really happened, news media pay some attention, but not the kind of attention they would pay if they really said something's happening here. But the other thing that happened is the very next day, and this was, a present to the governor and the mayor, the hostages were taken at the American embassy in Tehran. And so all of a sudden, we had a much easier story to process, us versus them instead of us versus us. And, all of a sudden, every night for over a year, we were listening to reports about that. But there are some other reasons. One is, it doesn't fit the traditional narrative of the civil rights movement, right? 1954, 1964, 65, victory, it's done, right? Where does this fit? And where does this fit? 1979. And so, one of the things that's so important about telling stories, I think, like 1939, 1979, is to get out of those constraints and to say, this history is still going. We need to keep addressing this. It's not over. It gets cleaned up, right? And this puts the hard parts back in, which we need to still process. And then there's this other thing, which is the cultivated American fear, right? Fear of agitation, fear of communism, fear of black power, fear of labor organizing, you know, and that fear really prevents us from dealing in an open way with a lot of new ideas, possibilities, things we could learn from. You know, we don't have to take a whole ideology to think that a good idea might come out of something that someone thinks. So anyway, I came with these, started reading, I came with a bunch of questions, and I wanted to know, well, you know, I had this idea, well, I'll just go and I'll put this story together, and then I'll show it to people, and they'll say, oh, in Greensboro, oh, of course, we just didn't understand. You can accuse me of trying to be a white savior, I guess. So I started talking to people in person, and I called up one of the prosecutors, right, who had lost the state murder case. And he was ill, and I knew this. And so I was sort of asking very gentle questions, just trying to get some feedback. But he got angrier and angrier as he talked about this, until he was yelling at me, those scumbags, about the Communist Workers' Party people that he was supposed to be representing, right? He was supposed to be prosecuting the Klan and Nazis, and he's calling the people he's representing scumbags to me on the phone, to the point where I was so worried about his health, I said, Jim, I think we need to get off the phone. Then I went to a guy who had been the managing director of the Greensboro News and Record. Actually, Greensboro had a morning and an afternoon paper at that point. Imagine, right? And this was the manager, had been the managing editor of the afternoon paper. And he said, well, no one knows who fired the first shot. And I looked at him, and I was like, this was a newspaper man. You're supposed to know the facts. You're not a defense lawyer for the Klan here. No one knows who fired the first shot. You know, and what I began to feel in his case was that that's the story he had to tell to get access to the social circles he wanted to fly in, right? If he wanted to go to the country club or wanted to do this or that, that's the story he had to sort of believe and internalize, and maybe he actually believed it by that point. Then I called up that mayor, right? The one who said, you know, nothing happening here. And he said, you are wasting everybody's time. He said, we've been over this and over this and over this. And then he said, and that jackass is still down there trying to tear the system down. He wouldn't even say Reverend Nelson Johnson's name. And then I ended up in a cop bar and found the cop who had arrested the people in that van, who had become sort of a hero. And I wanted to get his perspective on things. And he said, you know, what made me such a good cop, and this is a little shocking, trigger warning, this is shocking. He said, is that I could tell the difference between a good black man and a bad black man just by the way he walked. And if it was a bad black man, I would just follow him until he did something wrong and pick him up. I'm sitting there in this bar, and I'm thinking, holy smokes. And then he told me, I wish Nelson Johnson had been killed that day. James Baldwin said, history is the present. And boy, did I feel that. I walked out of there looking over my shoulder. I thought, whoa, there goes my idea of just lining up the facts, right? This is way deeper than that. And so I learned a lot doing this project. Things people know, but things I had to feel, and I got to feel them. So one of the things that became very important to me was to understand, you know, here were these people perpetrating this fear that I've talked about, right? This fear of the unknown, this fear of ideas, this fear of activism, this fear of black people. And we can go back through American history and talk about that from the very beginning, right? But what I came away with too was something much more specific in the 20th century, was the impact of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover really created a culture of fear around these issues. He went after everybody. And to maintain the social and economic status quo. And anyone who was troubling that, questioning that, became vilified and had operations run against them. And, that is how history gets erased, because you're afraid to talk about it. And so as I went through this, I felt more and more responsibility to trying to telling this story. And one of the things I had to deal with in part, to be honest, was I would say when these people would say these things, horrible things to me about the people at the center of my story, I'd say, is there something I don't know? Is there something they did that no one's telling me? But the answer was no. They just were troubled. They wanted things to be better and were willing to stick their necks out for it and make it inconvenient for the people in power. So I don't know if you've heard of Jason Staley. He's written a book recently called Erasing History. He's been a professor at Yale and is moving to Canada. And I was thinking this quote from him is helpful to me in thinking about what I've just been talking about. He said, by removing the history of uprisings against the current status quo from the curriculum, authoritarians leave students with the impression that the status quo has never been and cannot be challenged. And that's what I felt like I was encountering in Greensboro, was this idea of, you can't challenge this, right? And so I go out and I get this information, I have these experiences, very diametrically opposed experiences, right? The kind of experiences I was just telling you about. And then these interesting, deep conversations with the Johnsons and other people about what they were trying to do and how they were trying to change the world and the work they'd been doing from the mid-60s to now. Joyce Johnson grew up in Richmond, took a bus down with a cardboard suitcase in 1964 to be in the second class of African Americans admitted at Duke, and has been in North Carolina ever since. Nelson Johnson, when he made his shift from communism to sort of liberation theology, went to seminary at Virginia Union. And then there's Robert Marriage. So the judge from Richmond who went down. So there are a lot of Virginia connections in this story. But what is Morningside, the book, really about? Well, it's about the tragic killing of 5 remarkable and dedicated activists. These were amazing people. I haven't really talked about them individually, but these were brilliant, doctors, PhD students. All of these people were extremely smart. This Communist Workers' Party, I'll just quickly say, was a national organization. There was one group in Greensboro. It was headquartered in New York. There was a mayor of Oakland who was a member of the Communist Workers' Party at one point, the deputy mayor of New York, a best-selling physicist, author. This was a pretty heady group of people who thought they could change the world, as well as all the people they worked with who were incredibly brave in their communities. It's about why the police and FBI didn't prevent these murders when they could have. The police had an informant in the Klan. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had an infiltrator in the Nazi group, and the FBI was connected to both of them. And it's about how repression works in America in sort of a granular, very specific way. A good friend of mine from college, when I was told him about this book, he said, remember, bad ideas travel too. And we see that from the end of Reconstruction to the present. A lot of bad ideas have persisted. And one of the things that I took away also from this story is the importance of accountability. When you don't hold people like the shooters accountable, they're empowered. Those people were connected to 2017 in Charlottesville, and they were connected to January 6th, 2021. There's a through line. And in between, they were connected to Dylan Roof. Literally, I don't mean just abstractly. Dylan Roof held up Greensboro as a shining example of white supremacy and white supremacist violence. So it's so important that we try to hold people accountable. And if it doesn't happen in the moment, it has to happen in history. We have to keep telling the stories and hold them accountable any way we can. But it's also, this book is also about the resilience, adaptability, perseverance, and love of the Johnsons and the people around them, and community that has stood by them, and the long quest for democracy and to give it full access in this country. It's also about that. And ultimately, for me, it's about not giving in to cynicism. That's what I saw in them that day when I sat down with them. You know, and holding on. It was very interesting, holding on to the American ideals. They were motivated by American ideals of equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Because at the end of the day, they might be our most powerful justification for continuing to address sincerely the wrongs of our past and insisting on fairness and justice today. There's been a long, slow reckoning in Greensboro, and this is where this hard work of theirs has paid off. This is what, you know, if this part hadn't been happening, it would have been even harder to write this book, because it's hard. It's a hard history to sit with for a long time. It took me 7 years. But in 2004 to 2006, Greensboro did something that had never been done yet in this country. They held a truth and reconciliation process based on the South African model. Bishop Desmond Tutu came to Greensboro twice to counsel them on how to do it. Other people involved in the South African process came. It was a tremendous effort on part of Greensboro's civil society to pull this together, even though the city government wanted nothing to do with it. But nonprofits did, organizations did. They came together, and there were 2 years in which they held open fora in which lawyers, activists, policemen, some politicians, Klansmen came to talk about what they thought had happened that day and to share their truths. But that commission also produced an almost 600-page report about what they thought had happened that day. And this is so important, when the past isn't just about the past, said, well, how do we prevent this from happening again? And gave a long list of recommendations to the city of Greensboro, some of which they've actually enacted. So at first, Greensboro's sort of government and a lot of the elite are very resistant to this. But, you know, change, as we talked about here, takes a long time. You know, changing consciousness takes a long time. And really facing one's history takes a long time. So in 2017, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, someone stood up at the city council meeting in Greensboro a couple days later and said, Greensboro was prologue to that. And the Greensboro City Council suddenly held a vote and voted to apologize for 1979. But they didn't say what they were apologizing for. Then Ahmaud Arbery happens, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The country is reckoning for a moment. And in the depth of COVID on October 6, 2020, the city council holds a special meeting and apologizes and says what they're apologizing for. And they say that the police department could have prevented this violence and didn't. And they named scholarships in the names of the 5 murdered people, 5 murdered communists, with scholarships named after them in Greensboro for high school students who are interested in pursuing social justice. It's pretty remarkable. And one of the women who helped write that was a city councilor who had, in 1979, been working for one of the defense lawyers for the Klan. She had made this tremendous journey to coming to decide that she had been completely wrong about what had happened in 1979, and that the city was deeply involved in what had happened. And that, to me, is a hopeful moment. So I just want to leave with this idea that this resistance and dissent that we're talking about, J. Edgar Hoover tried to call it un-American and anti-American. But it's as American as hush puppies and apple pie. And, and the thing is, we need to accept that and not be afraid of it, and to understand that this is part of our history too. It's just as much a part of our history as everything in there. And that resistance has been there since the very beginning, since the first Europeans landed on this shore. So I'll just end on that note with, Melanie started with Frederick Douglass. I'm going to end with Frederick Douglass. Those who prefer to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want an ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing. Without a demand, it never did, and it never will. Thank you. Questions?
Hi, my name's Elaine. I wonder if, somebody with a little bit of marketing background, I wonder if the group had chosen a different name for their organization instead of, against communism, which is a very inflammatory word. If they had chosen something like, Christians for doing well in the world, or something like that, if they may have bought more communal support and inflamed less of the agitators, and if they would have gotten their purpose across more. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the white community response to them was outside of the police and that, because having community support goes a long way.
It wasn't just the white community. Everyone was terrified once they, in a sense, called themselves communists in that way. A lot of people were terrified because some people were scared probably because they were like, oh my gosh, communists are scary. And other people were scared because, well, if you call yourself communist, bad things are going to happen to you, right? That's a slightly different. It was a debate. I mean, a lot of the local people in the mills did not want them to call themselves that, and where you really see it play out is in the trials. The prosecutors were very uncomfortable having clients who called themselves communists, and they would distance themselves from them. That doesn't help in a trial when the person you're supposed to be advocating for is someone you're that uncomfortable with because of their beliefs or ideology. So it played a huge role, and what it allowed was the defense attorneys to say this had nothing to do with race. These were patriots, defending America from communists. Look, you send them all the way around the world to fight communists, and here you're letting communists march down our streets at home, And there is some hypocrisy in that, right? So, it played a big part in the perception of this. Now, the communist group had a parade permit from the city. They were marching legally. They were following the rules as they had been laid out to them, largely. The Klan and Nazis who drove up had no such permission to be there. And as I said, the authorities knew they were coming and never warned the activists that they were coming. So the thing about this history is when you dig into it, communism becomes a little bit of a cover for what's happening. The city already had a long relationship with Nelson Johnson. He had been holding them to account for almost 15 years by that point. And the police were taught. They had this list of people they called regulars. So there was the woman you had to be careful for because she might try to seduce you if you're a police officer. There was the guy who liked to pick fights with police officers. And there was the guy, Nelson Johnson, who was going to try to hold you, you had to watch what you did because he was going to hold you accountable, And so you didn't even have to know him personally as a police officer to feel animus toward him because you were taught to in the police department.
I'm curious about the reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned at one point one of the testifiers was the Klan.
Yeah, there were two.
Did they just give you their old story, or were they finally say, okay, here's what we really did?
One gave a new story and one gave an old story. So one of them, in this sort of very interesting sense of sort of cultural context, right, said, I grew up with my granddad's frying pan that he carried with him in the Civil War as a Confederate soldier. And the story is that he held it up and it blocked a bullet from a Northern soldier, and I still have that frying pan, and that's the culture I grew up with. And then he said, if I'd grown up in New York, maybe I'd be a communist. So there was some, an opening there, right? This was obviously an intelligent, sort of nimble guy. Then the man who basically had been the head of the Klan at that time got up and said to a stunned room of people where you could hear a pin drop, maybe God guided the bullets. So you had, and that was in 2005. So 2006. So you had different viewpoints. Mm-hmm. Mm. Okay.
So I mentioned earlier I'm from Greensboro.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your timeline of the research that you did. So I think you said you had your first meeting with the Johnsons in like 2015.
Well, it's 2017 when I was actually thinking about it.
Okay. I'm just kind of curious, like, how much interaction you had with, like, that current city council mayor, the people who were leaders in Greensboro at that time, and sort of what their openness was to your research and how they were approaching the aftermath or the current race relations and things like that.
Great question. There was a lot of wariness, to be honest with you. I think that people wanted the past to be past to some degree and didn't want to open it up too much. Most people didn't act like the people I just told you about and yell and call names. But for example, though, there were some very interesting things that happened, very curious things. And you wondered, I wondered, what is happening behind the scenes? So for example, I got in touch with the city attorney, introduced myself. We had a nice conversation. I told him what I was doing. He said, by gosh, you know what I got in my office right now? A whole bunch of boxes from that time that just came back from Iron Mountain. Iron Mountain's this big, secure, yeah? And he said, I've got them in my office. Why don't you come by and look at them? Here, call me tomorrow. He ghosted me after that. Like totally, I got so excited, right? I was like, oh my goodness. Never heard from him again. Never answered a call, an email, a text, nothing. And I was like, who did he talk to after that? Who told him no? Or did he just come to his senses? I don't know. Whatever it was. But darn, I would have liked to look in those boxes. First back there.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very enlightening and appreciate the work you've done. And one, collecting all the information, and the harder part is publishing. So making it beautiful. It's pretty good. So I have a question for you. Just in all the research you've done, do you have any insights of what's the formula or what are the ingredients, what's the catalyst that makes people, move people to say, have a reconciliation committee like you said there? And I'm thinking of things like Tulsa, the recollection what we did in the local one, Tulsa, or even like Juneteenth, having recollection Juneteenth as a national holiday. What's the formula? What are you picking up that leads to that kind of change?
You mean leans to a process happening, or
Process, or events that in fact turn into around say, yeah, we better do something, or a process.
I think it takes people who are willing to push the idea that their community will be better off if the truth is told than if they're hiding it. And that takes a lot of effort. And you go out on a limb, right? Because a lot of people are going to say, do we really need to do this? You know? Do we really need to look at these hard parts? And what happened it's really interesting actually in Greensboro. What the catalyst, and this is, how art can be a catalyst for things. A woman wrote a play about this incident, and they showed it in Greensboro. And a young man who was at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, brought his father, who had been on the jury in the state murder trial. And the father walked out and he said, if I had seen this play before, I would have changed my vote to guilty in that murder trial. And when Nelson Johnson heard that, he thought, whoa, people can change on this story, And then he thought, well, we could do more. And then it was sort of interesting because a foundation in New York was looking for a pilot to pilot a truth and reconciliation process in this country to see if it could work here. And they landed on Greensboro. And then Greensboro, though, became for a while a place where people came to learn about how it could work and then take it back to their communities. So for example, I'm from Maine, and the Wabanaki people in Maine did a big truth and reconciliation process, and they made a pilgrimage to Greensboro to learn about how to do it. But I think it really takes people who are really committed to, having the truth be told. Yeah.
Was there any film that you came upon of the march and of the shooting?
I forgot to mention that. That's one of the things that makes this such a modern moment. I can't believe I forgot to mention that. There were 4 news crews there filming. You can go watch it on YouTube if you've got the stomach for it. It's hard to watch. But there were 4 news crews. And so this whole thing was filmed.
The reason I asked is that years ago, I brought Haile Gerima, the Ethiopian filmmaker who's living in D.C., to the University of Kansas, where I was at the time, and with a lot of his films at that time. And a little later, when I moved here, I met up with him again and saw some more of his films because I wanted to do an article on him. And one of them, when you're talking about Greensboro, and he did a documentary called Wilmington 10, USA 10,000.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, did this happen also at that same time in Wilmington?
Lots of connections. So it's so interesting because, the thing about it is so much, North Carolina gets overlooked in a lot of ways as a place where really, really important things are happening that are national in scope. And I think, recently with the politics going red, blue, or whatever, purple, it's getting some more attention. But, Greensboro needs to be talked about in North Carolina as one of the important centers of Black power in this country, right? Like it's Oakland and and Detroit and Chicago. Greensboro's right there. They weren't, in Greensboro, they weren't Black Panthers. Nelson Johnson was not a sort of charismatic leader, but he was probably one of the best organizers in the whole country, and people came to Greensboro to learn from him, you know? So Wilmington 10, these guys that I'm writing about were very active in defending the Wilmington 10 folks, having marches in Raleigh and in other places to try to get them released. And they knew them. I mean, this was they were part of that activist world. So when there's a big rally and march in Greensboro in February 2nd, 1980, so just a few months to, in a sense, a march for justice and against the Klan, in which people from all over the country came to sort of put pressure on the justice system to do something about what had happened in Greensboro. And Ben Chavis is one of the keynote speaker at that event. What's also interesting is that all those folks were in jail until just after the shooting in Greensboro. And then they were released. And there's some thought that, that wasn't a coincidence, that, we've got a new thing to do. Let's get rid of this old one. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It sounded like people were reluctant to talk about it. So what was the press coverage like at the time? Did they actually report on it? Was it fair and balanced?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest with you. It's a mixed bag. One of the things I was thinking about this as I came over here today is, despite the imperfect reporting on this, there is a record. There were these local papers. There were hundreds of articles written locally about this. Thank goodness for me. That's much harder today, like with the dearth of local reporting. Boy, it gives me something to work with. I can read it and I can figure out if they're right or wrong, So what a gift it was to have all these different articles. Now, some of the reporters were great, and some of them were clearly writing stories that have been fed to them by authorities. So, for example, when the 1979 shooting happens, the next day there's an article about Nelson Johnson, which they say, yeah, his whole life has been haunted by violence, and he was just in jail in Alabama. He'd never been in jail in Alabama, And so you're like, okay, that was a planted story, right? To try to set the tone about how Greensboro should think about this.
So one story I have, my high school teacher gave birth that day, and she was in the hospital in Greensboro, and she remembers coming out of, she's all excited, she's got a baby, and she's like, all the TVs we talked, it was all over the TV.
Yeah.
That this had happened, and so there definitely was TV stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what they were showing, and I don't know what happened after that, but she was just like, I just had the best day of my life, and then this is happening around me. So there was at least something.
Oh, no, there was a lot, actually, particularly locally. There was never a big independent investigation by a major news media that came in and did it. But there was a lot of reporting. Yeah. I mean, Jim Melvin, the mayor, went into the TV station to try to get them not to air the footage and report on it when it happened, but they defied him, and they did. Yeah.
Johnson still call himself a communist by the time?
No, he went to seminary so after the trials are done. One of the things the shooting did was he had deep roots in Greensboro's Black community, and had been supported by, actually, it's very interesting because Greensboro had they've got North Carolina A&T and Bennett College for Women, right? and then all the other colleges there. And it was the per capita, the highest educated African American population in the country, like on a per capita basis. And a lot of successful people, right? Doctors, lawyers, business people. And they're supporting Nelson Johnson all the way up until the shooting. And then he loses that connection. And it's extremely painful for him, right? And so he and Joyce decide to start going back to church to try to build community again. And he gets embraced and decides to go into the church and become a pastor. And so...
Attention customers, it is now 7:30. The library will close in 30 minutes. The internet station will shut down automatically at 7:45. All continuing copy jobs must be finished by 7:45. Thank you.
I know someone. We're talking about the, Brace the Church. The people he was trying to work for and the ultimate goals didn't really change, but some of the methods changed and the rhetoric changed. And, the idea of a dictatorship or the proletariat went out the window. And it was replaced by, this real sense of revolutionary love and this idea that a kind of agape, right, of goodwill, and that extended to people beyond you, and that you don't know is what is going to have a transformational power, and that he works with. But he was never stopped being absolutely relentless on police brutality, on injustice, any kind of injustice that happened in Greensboro, he was there. February 9th. 81. Yeah. He lived a lot. Yes, sir.
I was part of an art history program called Wall of Respect in 1967.
Called what?
Wall of Respect.
Huh. In 1967?
And I've been here for 2 months, and I am astounded with the history of this city. And the question I have for you is, when do you think, if you go to the future 50 years, do you think America will ever grow up racially? Or do you think that's just something that's a lost art, that's something we will never ever see in our life?
Does anyone want to help me out with that? I've been thinking that young people seem to be so much more relaxed about a lot of things. I hope that's true. But, when people start blowing whistles and stirring up old fears and old anxieties, it sets us back. So, I hope so. I hope so. What do you think?
Men don't like each other because they don't talk to each other. They don't like each other. They don't know each other. They don't talk to each other. I think Alexandria, this city, can be the starting point for it. Because since it was the starting point years ago for a lot of other things. And I think if we can live together, talk together, eat together here, then it can go other places. But if you can't do it here, my whole life changed. And I just said, can this be where, because I came from California for the inauguration, my friends started when I didn't leave. Now I got an apartment here, so now I'm definitely not leaving. But I'm hoping to see the country change. We're seeing how it's changing. But I don't think that's the real change that the country really wants. But I'm wondering if the country can start to change from a little city like this. Because what I see in this room is not really Alexandria. See, that's another thing too. This room to me is like
This is what the country should be. But to me, Alexandria, the whole of Alexandria is not like this room for some reason. I see a contradiction. I don't know what I'm saying right now. From just what I see. And I just walk around taking pictures and I just watch. Like I watch, and thanks for the meal too. But I'm glad I'm so glad I came in here because I went to that library where those kids are. That library is here. And I went to that library and the history that this place has, unbelievable. But I'm hoping that this city could be, because God puts me in different places. I'm in California with my podcast. I don't want to go back home. I want to stay right here and I get to meet you. And please take your book to Chicago. WBOA it loves this type of history. Even though it has its own history. I'm not going to really deal with this segregation and everything else. But I applaud you for, I'm glad I stopped. Thank you. I came here to wash my soul food. And it was so worked up. It was so
You know, it's interesting, you sound like Nelson Johnson, because he would say, Greensboro could be the model.
We can start it here, and it can go out from Greensboro. And what's interesting about that is, you know, it had been true. You know, the sit-ins had started there, other things had started there. And that's what made the FBI in some ways so nervous about Nelson Johnson. They said Greensboro had a reputation. Things start here and spread. So they kept a very close eye on it. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Aran.
Thank you.
And we appreciate him wearing our 85th anniversary pin. Just a little
With
plug
honor.
there. Yes. Linda Rudd. So we have books.
Oh, hey, Linda.
So Linda Rudd is the person how we managed to get Aran to come to Alexandria. So thank you so much.
She's got pull, right?
Yeah, she's got some clout. But we do have some books for sale. Is that correct? We have books for sale, and Aran will be up here signing. You will hear other announcements, but there is, I think, still some food out there, so please take some. We have a number of programs and everything throughout the Alexandria Library System, and we appreciate your support and the fact that Alexandrians know the true value of a public library. As you've heard in the news recently, the Institute for Museum and Library Services has been a department that has been shut down, and that was where the federal funding came from for public libraries. And while the Alexandria Library System has not been impacted directly by that, we have been impacted indirectly, so it will possibly affect the databases and the types of material that we would get through the Library of Virginia that we provide for students who are doing their homework and their research. Things such as summer reading. We know that the summer learning loss is real, and it's important that our children read over the summer months. And the Library of Virginia normally provided the handouts, the kits, and the packets that we give to children in that regard. And so I want to thank you for your support for Alexandria's library. We have All Alexandria Read going on right now. That's the One Book, One Read, where we ask the entire community to let's come together and read the same book. And so James is what it's called, is one of those books. For those of you, I see some nodding heads, who have read it, but for those of us who did the whole Huckleberry Finn, you know, Mark Twain sort of thing, it's the story from the eyes of Jim. So I think it's a book well worth reading. And there's so many other things that you can come and go and learn from your public library. So I just want to thank you all for your time this evening, and hope to see you again. Thank you so much.